The last few episodes of Retro Unscripted have been spent talking about Midway's arcade sports games. We've talked about NBA Jam and NBA Jam Tournament Edition. We've talked about NBA Hang Time. We've talked about NFL Blitz and its games that continued well into the PlayStation 2, Xbox, and GameCube generations. But there are a couple of other games that I didn't have a chance to touch on, and I wanted to use this opportunity to wrap up the series by talking about them. The first one, from 1996, is Wayne Gretzky's 3D Hockey. If you haven't played this, Wayne Gretzky's 3D Hockey differs from NHL Open Ice in that players are comprised of polygons. There are some different camera perspectives that you can use in order to play. There are some special moves, like there's a flaming shot that you can do depending on where you are on the ice, and certain button combinations you can use. It's a unique take, at least as far as arcade hockey goes, and it's more memorable for the Nintendo 64 than it was on coin-op. Not one of my favorite games, but still stands out as a game that I spent a lot of time on when I got my 64 back in late 1996. So that's Wayne Gretzky's 3D Hockey. There was also a version that came out for 1998. There was an Olympic hockey game that used the same engine, and then the series just kind of disappeared. So those are the Wayne Gretzky's 3D Hockey games. The last of Midway's big arcade sports titles was basically a follow-up to NBA Hang Time using the NFL Blitz graphics scheme. By now, visuals were all comprised of polygons. There was a lot more detail. Graphics were 60 frames a second. It was really what we expected at the time. So with NBA Showtime, or NBA on NBC Showtime, this is the PlayStation version. You can see the Nintendo 64 version behind me. There are a couple of key differences from NBA Hang Time. At its core, it's very similar to Hang Time. Double dunks and alley-oops are back. Team Fire is back. It feels very similar to Hang Time, but players who like to play rough, players who like to use turbo and pass to shove players in order to steal the ball, now get fouls. And if you get a certain number of fouls in a quarter, then the opposing team gets the ball and they get to shoot a free throw for 3 points. Say that 3 times fast, I dare you. Free throw for 3 points. So that can change the balance of the game. So the key in NBA Showtime is to be very careful with how much shoving you do, and only get a little rough with opposing players who have the ball when you know that you need the ball back for possession purposes, or perhaps when there's less than a minute to go in the quarter and you have a couple of fouls to give. Other than that, though, very much like Hang Time, you can create your own character based on different body parts and adjust their height, their statistics, depending on how many games you play. You can answer trivia questions. All that stuff is there. And it was a lot of fun to play in arcades. That's where I played it originally. The next version of the game that I had, which I sadly don't have anymore, is the Sega Dreamcast version of NBA Showtime, which is just phenomenal. 60 frames per second animation speed, detail that looks just like the arcade game. Maybe the sprite, maybe the characters are just a little bit smaller, but it's not really that big a deal. The only thing that's missing is coin slots to put your tokens in. It was that good, and that's the Dreamcast version. The Nintendo 64 version over here runs at a pretty quick clip, but the players aren't quite as detailed, and Eurocom Software kind of did some screwy things with the sound a little bit. Granted, some of that's because of the limited space on Nintendo 64 cartridges, but the same problem exists with the PlayStation version as well. And the PlayStation version is the worst of all. The graphics are on the muddy side. There are even fewer frames of animation, and it feels tired after a while. Like, shots don't even really go through a basket. They just kind of go through the rim rather than through the basket. It's something that's nitpicky, but still something that I noticed. So those are the Showtime games. Not my favorites of the NBA games. Jam, of course, is on top, and then Hang Time is just behind that, and then Showtime would probably be third. I'm not judging any of the sequels like Tournament Edition, and I'm certainly not going to put this anywhere on my list, and I promised in my video log last night I wouldn't talk about it, but I have to. This sucker right here, NBA Hoopz, which was published by Midway and developed by Eurocom Software, adds a third player to the court, which just makes things confusing. There are all kinds of sound bugs and sound glitches. There's a Hoopz button that I still don't understand what it does. It was the version of Showtime that we were supposed to get as far as PlayStation 2 owners go, and we never really got that version. We got this crap instead. Avoid it. Don't buy it. I don't care if Shaq's on the cover. I love Shaq to death, but not this game. Don't do it. So that's it. At that point, Midway was pretty much done with arcades, and it was all console-based stuff that they were making sports games for, new franchises and old. And there were two sports, aside from football, that Midway focused on. The first was hockey, and I was very glad that Midway decided to go back to hockey because I'm a hockey fan, so I'm a little bit biased. The new games, rather than go with open ice or use Wayne Gretzky, new games were called NHL Hitz. This here is the 2002 version, and this was developed by Black Box Games, who eventually wound up being signed on by EA, and I believe they did Need for Speed Hot Pursuit 2 for them. So they've had a decent career after that, but hockey was something they did really well. NHL Hitz is kind of to hockey what Showtime was to basketball and Blitz was to football. Upgrades the graphics to polygons, a lot more detail in the visuals. The games are a lot snappier. And there are a lot more secrets in this game because it's developed for consoles. So Black Box and then later developers in this series were able to pack in extra arenas and hidden players and other things that you can buy with credits that you earn by constantly playing the game. So that's how Midway got around people having to constantly pump in quarters. Is getting people to replay the game was as easy as promising secrets and cheats and other things that you could get just by playing the game and accumulating enough credits to buy these things. So NHL Hitz 2002 was pretty good. Then NHL Hitz 2003, this is the one that I have the case for, and there's Pronger on the cover, is a somewhat better version of the game. There are a few additions like hockey schools in there, and there are some extra mini games in there. It's a pretty good game, and if you can find it, I got this not for $25. I got it for $5, and it was a good deal. And then finally, last but not least, and my favorite game in the series actually, is NHL Hitz Pro with Nick Lidstrom on the cover there. Hitz Pro tries to be a little bit more like real hockey if you want it. If you don't want penalties and you don't want to deal with line changes and all that other stuff, you can elect to take that out and play it very much arcade style. But if you don't, if you want a little bit more realism, you can have that in there. But there are things like wraparound goals and deflections that weren't in the earlier two games, and it's just a lot of fun to play. So if you can only own one of the three, I highly recommend trying to track down NHL Hitz Pro, and that was available for the Xbox and for the PS2. I'm not sure if there was a GameCube version. I'd have to check. So that's hockey. Was really glad to see hockey make the move. Now, the other sport that Midway decided to go to was baseball. Now, this was something that NBA Jam creator Mark Turmel wanted to do for arcades, but was never able to do it. And that's the Slugfest series. Here is Slugfest 2003 right here. Then after that came, obviously, 2004, then 2006, and there are a bunch of different players on the cover there. And then, last but not least, is Slugfest Loaded that has more simulation elements on there, and people like that aspect of it, I guess. I gotta be honest, I was never a fan of the Slugfest games. I have them in my library because they're Midway games, and I'm a big Midway guy. But the Slugfest games, specifically baseball, it's really difficult to make an arcade-style baseball game, especially at that point in time. Granted, if you go back to the NES and you look at games like RBI Baseball, like Nintendo's own baseball game, like Bad News Baseball, like Baseball Stars, games like those, you were they were very accessible. You could play them very easily, very pick up and play. With Slugfest, once you get out of the pitcher-batter confrontation or matchup or whatever you want to call it, once you get to fielding, the game just becomes a mess. It's very difficult to field. The earlier versions of Slugfest, you couldn't turn off a situation where you're running bases or your opponent's running bases and he can just punch you and knock the ball out of your glove, kind of like Alex Rodriguez there. That was just kind of weak. For me, if you're talking a baseball game, unless it's RBI Baseball or Bad News Baseball or even Super Baseball 2020 or Super Baseball Baseball Stars or whatever, any of those games from years gone by, they did arcade right. This idea from Mark Trammell and later expanded upon, just it didn't work for me. Perhaps it did for you. If it did, tell me why in the comments or drop me a line in the blog or something and let me know. I'd love to hear a compelling argument as to why the Slugfest games are good, because I can't find any. I hate to say that, being the Midway guy that I am, but I couldn't do it. And then after that, Midway was gone. There were no more Midway arcade sports games, although EA did bring back NBA Jam and NFL Blitz after getting the licenses for both. I personally like both versions of those on the Xbox 360 and PS3, specifically the NBA Jam on Fire Edition for both on Xbox Live Arcade and on the PlayStation Store. Those are great versions, and if you find them on sale cheap or you have some extra points or money in your wallet for those, I do recommend grabbing those. And that's it. I've covered them all, at least the major ones, the licensed ones. If we went back a little bit in Midway's history, you had games like Arch Rivals, which predated NBA Jam and was really where a lot of the ideas for NBA Jam seemed to come from. 2-on-2 basketball play, punching other players in order to get to steal the ball or maybe to get yourself in better position for rebounds. That was Arch Rivals. You can get a version of that for the NES. I think there's a Genesis version. And then if you get Midway Arcade Treasures 2, I believe that's on there as well. And then there's Super High Impact Football, which is available for the Genesis and the Super Nintendo, which is very much like a real football game, but fewer rules to worry about. And if you lay enough big hits on the opponent, you can actually start a fight where it's all of your guys versus all of their guys, and whoever punches the button fast enough wins the fight. That kind of is what it is. Playing it on console isn't quite as good as playing in the arcade, but if you find it for a couple of dollars for your Genesis or Super Nintendo, I say go for it. So anyway, that's all of them. That's all of the Midway Sports arcade titles. I hope you guys have enjoyed this series. I know it ran a little bit longer than I anticipated, but we'll get to different games with the next installment of Retro Unscripted, and I hope you guys will join me. Until then, take care of yourselves, and I will see you on the next Retro Unscripted.